All right. I was watching that last video we did, and I don't know why I got ahead of myself and I misspoke Leibniz's name. It's not George Friedrich Wilhelm Leibniz, it's George Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel. And that's who we're going to start with today. Leibniz is just Gottfried, just good old Gottfried Leibniz. And so we ended with Kant last class, which really closes out the period that's considered modern philosophy. And I know that's weird to think about, but maybe it's just because philosophers are a little ahead of the curve. So modernism for philosophy was the 16th through 18th centuries. It's just so weird to think about. So philosophers are already into postmodernism by the time we get to the 19th century in their thinking. It just took pop culture a while to catch up in the West. Like, it probably wasn't until the 50s and the beat movement, the beatniks and all that, leading into the hippies and yippies, where we really get postmodernism saturating American culture. But this was going on in Europe and Germany in the 1800s. Okay, so at least the thought part that was bringing up. So we're going to start with Hegel today. And Hegel wanted this unified view of philosophy. He was kind of like a historical philosopher, but he realized in trying to explain the philosophers that came before him, he had to explain the medieval philosophers. And to understand the medieval, he had to understand the ancient. So he ends up working out this huge philosophy of history. And the first thing I want you to know about Hegel, even though I believe Kant, just like Thomas Aquinas, opened the windows to reason, and so we get this faith-reason mix going on in the latter part of the Middle Ages, taking us into the modern period, and then we see faith diminishing and reason growing in its power and influence in the philosophical systems of the West. But then when we get to Kant, he opens the door to this very Eastern type of thinking, even though he's so Western in his mindset, but he's not content with that Aristotelian law of non-contradiction, right? Or that the idea of correspondence theory of truth. He wanted a more inclusive idea of truth. And so the first thing to help you understand Hegel, oh, and I got a dead pen. I don't know if we can do it right. We might have to go find a pen. All right, so with Hegel, he begins with this idea of the truth is the whole. And you need to keep coming back in your mind to this when we're talking about Hegel, because he's going to sound all over the road. At some points he's going to sound like a materialist, at other times he's going to sound like a theist, and at other times he's going to sound like a pantheist. But you have to take his philosophy as a unified whole if you want to understand what he's getting at. Okay? And this is going to tie back in to, if you remember, John Scotus Erigena. And Plotinus. And the Neoplatonists. Hey, Jacob, could you just check in the other classrooms and see if you can find a black pen for me? Because if I have to write in red, I want to go. Or Justin, not Jacob. All right, Plotinus, Neoplatonism. And so just real quick, because it's going to come up again, if you remember the great chain of being. Where we've got God, demiurge. Yes, right on, thank you. No problem. God, the demiurge, spirits, humans, and that weird horizon point, animals, minerals, plants, minerals, all the way down to non-being or nothing. what's going to get freaky today is I'm going to teach you how everything and nothing is actually the same thing by definition. And we have Hegel to thank for this, but also John Scotus Erigena. So I want to go back to him a little bit, because I don't think I talked about his dialectic. Now, dialectic takes on a lot of different meanings in philosophy. When we go all the way back to Socrates, he had the dialectical method, which he was having a dialogue with people, right? He wasn't just this talking head lecturing at people, but they were going on a journey together where someone would claim to know something, Socrates would have follow-up questions, and they would have this dialogue. Well, I have a very dialectic mind. I don't even need another person to have a conversation with. Whenever I hear something or I'm exposed to some new idea or concept, automatically my mind will take that proposition and I'll look at its antithesis or its opposite. And I'll try to wrestle these two ideas or concepts in my head, sometimes to the point of exhaustion. But the goal isn't just to paralyze myself with conflicting thoughts, but to find a synthesis between the two. And this is the kind of dialectic that John Scotus was doing. And part of what he was trying to get across was, we can posit things like God is love. What would the antithesis of God is love be? Or the antithesis?
God is not love.
Yeah, God is not love. John Scotus would say both of these statements are equally true and not true at the same time. And what he means by that is, this human word of love can in no way encapsulate what it means that God is love. Okay? So it's just as accurate to say God is not love, if we're talking about human love, as it is to talk about God is love, which is all of human love and beyond. So his synthesis between the thesis and the antithesis is God is supra love. Or you could say beyond love. But if we go back to Hegel, Hegel would be very fine with this. In fact, I think he should have given this guy some credit, this 9th century Irish monk. But Hegel simply saying, the truth is the whole. You have to take all of these different movements together in their totality. What Scotus is trying to do is to point the otherworldliness, the holiness of God. But if you remember, for him, God is at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end, right? It's that which creates and is not created is the same as that which is not created and does not create. Fascinating, at least in Scotus's mind. Hegel takes this idea of the dialectic and he applies it to philosophy and metaphysics. In fact, this very concept of Geist, which is German for spirit, and he really believes history is the story of Geist moving through human affairs and what we have become made aware of. And so for Hegel, he starts with this thesis of non-being. And we'll posit this with everything, or all being. You could say nothing. Okay, I'm not going to write this down. I'm going to say it slowly for you, though. By definition, nothing is that of which nothing can be added to or taken away from. Because if I could add something to nothing, it wouldn't be nothing anymore. And if I could take something away from nothing, it wouldn't have been nothing to begin with. Okay, got it?
Correct.
Now wait for it. Everything is that of which nothing can be added to or taken away from. Because if you add something to everything, it wasn't everything. And if you take something away from everything, it's not everything anymore. So by definition, everything and nothing have the same definition. That of which nothing can be added to or taken away from. And what is the synthesis between everything and nothing? What's in between everything and nothing?
All things.
No, that's everything.
Something.
Something! Because something ain't nothing, but it sure isn't everything.
Yeah.
So it's in between these movements. And Hegel would say the truth is the whole. Nothing, everything, and something. And this is how he sees the Spirit of God moving from absolute non-being, or you could even say pure being, it doesn't matter, into everything we know and see and experience in the world. But it starts with God's Spirit coming into this space-time continuum and then unfolding through human events. And so he begins with this idea of like desire. And out of this nothingness, this void, this vastness, we have the inklings of desire beginning, almost like tendrils or roots coming out of the abyss, out of the chaos. And this comes into the earliest civilizations, which he would see as like savage, barbaric. He would liken this to like tribal religions or political systems, or even like the despotic views in the East, where you would have maybe like god kings or these sorts of things. And he believes out of this process, Geist manifests itself into the world, or the Spirit of God, if you prefer, is manifesting itself into the world until it gets to the Greek materialist. But the problem with the Greeks, as we already noticed, was they were so good at looking at and evaluating this physical material world that they confused the physical material world with God himself. But when the fullness of time had come, Christ enters into the scene, and now we have this Spirit, or Geist, manifesting itself in the person of Jesus the Christ. And for the first time in cosmic history, God can know himself. And you might say, wait a second, this is the omniscient being? This is the first time he can know himself? I'm speaking in human linear terms here, not in eternity. But in this space-time continuum, it took the incarnation for God to be able to look back from history to know himself, and know himself in the incarnation. And then from that point on, any human that so had the Spirit of Christ in them could participate in this movement of Geist through human history. Yeah, we had things like inquisitions and people burned at the stakes, little thorns along the way, but this finally ends with German Romanticism. And I don't mean romanticism like a Harlequin romance novel. I mean people who have looked at the world and they say it's not enough. There's something beyond the physical, material reality. There's also a spiritual dimension. And that's what this German transcendental idealism was into. Yes, there's a real concrete physical world like Kant is positing, but we are bringing something to it. But it's not just us. The very Spirit of God is shaping and forming history. And so Hegel is saying it takes this transcendental philosophy to actually understand for the first time, because the problem with Christianity, it's all dealing in metaphors. For example, and I know this is going to sound a little blasphemous to you all. I don't mean it that way. I don't think Hegel meant that way. He saw himself as a devout Lutheran. But this idea of God as our Father, is that literal, physical, material? Or is that a metaphor? Is that a figure of speech to explain our relationship? I mean, and I don't want to be crude, but God did not seed us in a physical, material sense. Although if you look at 1 John 3:9, it sure does imply that our new life comes from the very seed of God. But we'll talk about that later. We're not there yet. So this idea that Christianity is great and wonderful and it tells us the truth of God, but it's so wrapped in metaphor, symbolism, analogy that we need philosophy to show us actually what's happening. And we get beyond the physicalism, we get beyond the pictures, and we're coming out of the cave basically, walking in the full light of day. So basically, like John Scotus before before him, Hegel is basically saying it is philosophy that opens the heavens, right? Not religion, not the Greek materialism, the sciences, but philosophy itself. And then with this, we come to the full budding of Western thought. Make some petals here. This full bloom of Western thought. But what happens after the bloom? Anyways, in this bloom, humanity is self-realized, and we realized who we are in God and that we are part of God's movement. But this is the cosmic loop piece, because once we have this God realization or consciousness, or that we have been knit together with the Godhead, it loops back into itself, because now we are one with the Spirit, one with the Geist. And so we become part of this process, or this cosmic loop of God moving through history. That's my little cosmic loop dance, right? Where it's just this incessant flow in like that torus shape of everything moving and flowing, etc. Any questions on this? So, God being the Alpha and the Omega and everything in between, but it's not a linear line. It's like a cosmic, self-perpetuating loop with no beginning and no end. World without end.
Which is funny because I don't know, I go around and I see that like in my everyday life.
This?
Mm-hmm. Oh,
Loops?
Not loops, like a cycle, a repetition or a consistency of repetition.
Yeah. Right.
It's pretty neat.
Want to move over here with me, Colleen? Okay, so what ends up happening? Man, this thing's almost dead too. I mean, it's a dead pin day. What happens after the bloom normally in a plant? What does the bloom turn into? Okay, pollination, then what happens to the flower?
Yeah, decays.
Not yet. Something else happens. I know I'm not living in an agrarian culture here.
That is fertile.
Yes, and the flower produces fruit, which is, what's the fruit of the flower? Seeds. Seeds, okay, you get rose hips, right? The roses turn into rose hips, and if you open up the rose hips, it contains the seeds. And personally, I think this is what happened. Rather than us coming to total self-consciousness or God awareness or however you want to phrase it, after this German Enlightenment period, I feel like it went back to seed. And so we have this great blooming and flowering, but contained within this become the seeds of the future. And I'm going to highlight two of these seeds for the remainder of this journey, because I think they're still the two dominant philosophies. They definitely were of the 20th century, and moving into the 21st century, we can still kind of see them acting out. And the first of these seeds I want to start with comes from Karl Marx. And if you're familiar with his writings, what he is actually proposing is called dialectical materialism. So he loves Hegel's dialectic and this progression, but remember, for Marx, being a materialist, he doesn't believe in souls or spirits or the non-material world. So what he's seeing is kind of like a materialistic evolutionary progression from simple to complex, and the same thing with human beings, starting off maybe more primitive, becoming more sophisticated. In a more primitive state, it's going to be more tooth and claw and everyone out for themselves. But as we mature and grow and evolve as a species, we're going to become more communal and collectively minded. And that is this idea of communism, right? This collective, communal sort of approach, not everyone out for themselves. So Marx loved Hegel's dialectic, he just hated his theology. He didn't want God to be a part of it. For Marx, history was the story of human struggle, specifically class struggle. And so this is going to trip you out. This is how most people know about Hegel's dialectic. It's from Marx. It's not even from Hegel. And so if we start with our thesis, and let's make it big, like let's do empire. We'll start at the time of the Roman Empire, just so you can see how this kind of works itself out. So in the Roman Empire, our thesis, or our top dog, would be the emperor. What's the antithesis of an emperor?
Peasant?
Even worse than a peasant, slave. Now, what Hegel believes happens in history is you get these movements. So you have this imperial, nobility, masters, and slaves. I mean, this is the great gross inequality in human history, where you have some people that have it all and some people who don't have nothing, including their own selves. But this moves into a synthesis, and this is what we would call like the feudal system. So we move out of the imperial system into the feudal system, but now each new synthesis becomes the new thesis of the next movement. So here in feudalism, we don't have an emperor, but we have a king. What's the antithesis of a king? You had it the first time. Peasant or serf. So these people aren't slaves, but they're bound to the land. So they're like semi-slaves. They don't have absolute freedom, but they don't have it as bad off as an actual slave. A king still has it pretty good, but not near as good as an emperor. So you see, both of them have kind of been modified a little bit towards the mean, towards the middle. And then the synthesis between these two, we get into like the merchant system, the formation of guilds, of these crafts, of trades, banking, all these sorts of things happen. People are actually buying titles that have enough capital or money. And so here we have I don't know if that's right, but the bourgeoisie, that's as close as I can get. Those are the people that own the means of production. They own the forests, they own the minerals, they own the rights to the lakes and rivers. And then the people that work for them, called the proletariat. These are like day laborers or people who work for pay. They give you some of their time and energy and strength, and in return you pay them money. So that's better than a serf. And once again, this is less than a king, but these people are still doing pretty good. Now this next synthesis, or this next movement, Hegel believed was going to be communism. But this is where I think he got it wrong. I mean, not Hegel, I'm sorry, Marx. Thought the culmination where we would have this great equality or equity would come in communism. I just think he got a little ahead of himself, because I think what this is really producing isn't communism, but it's capitalism, where people are using capital to invest, make money, and what. So I'll do the rest in black, because now it's Blackburn, not Marx. I think what was actually happening was capitalism. this over here. What's the antithesis of capitalism? That's where I think the communism comes in. So if you can figure out what the synthesis is between capitalism and communism, you can kind of predict the next movement in human history, at least according to Marx, building off of Hegel. And I actually think it's exactly what we're seeing in our society right now. What's in between capitalism and communism? Socialism. Anyone say Bernie, right? But another movement we're also seeing in our society as we speak is what's the antithesis to socialism? What's the opposite of coming together as a collective or working together in society for the common good? Anyone know this symbol? Anarchy. Where it's everyone for themselves. There is no external law or authority. And we see this huge anarchical movement happening in our culture as well. So you have these counterpoints, these movements. If you can tell what's going to come after these two, what's the synthesis between socialism and anarchy, that's quite the trick. And I personally believe it's this. We go back to a totalitarian state, a fascist state, because that's the only way to deal with anarchy, right? Absolute iron fist control. And then the process starts all over again. Everyone else is in subjugation, and then history unfolds, and you got the little cosmic loop happening all again. Freaky. You can apply this to so much stuff. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. I think I use the example of a movie, a black or a white movie, but really what you're seeing is a grayscale movie that has some black and white for highlight or contrast, but the reality is most of it's grayscale. That's where we're living. That's what we're seeing. Questions, comments on this? You guys are being so subdued. I need another pen. All right. The last guy in our little journey, and there's certainly philosophers, thank you. There's certainly philosophers after Kierkegaard, but for me, I am more than happy to end with him. And Kierkegaard was a Danish philosopher. Whenever I go to conferences, I always pronounce his name, Gah. It's kind of funny. They'll be talking about Søren Kierkegaard. But Søren, he's writing in the early 1800s in Denmark, and he is actually a Christian philosopher. But unlike Marx, when he looked at Hegel's dialectic, he loved the God piece, that yes, history is about God moving through, interacting with, and redeeming mankind. But he hated his ivory tower piece, this idea of everything was just this neat little recipe of point, counterpoint, synthesis. And Kierkegaard's like, have you walked around the streets lately? Have you seen the poverty, the degradation, the abuse? And what about that part? What about this internal subjective self? So where Marx was really appealing to the collective, I mean, he really cared about the working class people. He didn't want them to just become like cogs in this corporate machine, but that they would have some sense of self and worth, but not as individuals, but as a collective of humanity. Kierkegaard, on the other hand, was all in for the individualism. In fact, radical individualism. In fact, on his gravestone, he just said, all I want written is the individual. And he was focused on this idea of experiential truth. And this is why I like to give him the title of the father of existentialism. Can anyone tell me what existentialism is? It's a trick question. The reason it's a trick question is it's so hyper-individualistic that each of you could give me whatever definition you wanted, and they would be equally valid. Whoa. So what I'm going to give you are a list of existential themes that some, but not all, existentialists may or may not adhere to. But you have to look at it really kind of loosey-goosey like that, because the whole point with the individualism is you don't get to define me or even my terms for me. I get to say what my words mean. Okay? And so these are themes that many existentialists would agree apply. We already got the individual. But because we are such radical individuals, it brings alienation. In other words, in this classroom, there's all these individual beings. Some of you know each other. You might live in the same apartment. Some of you might be dating. There might even be some soul mate level status going on in this room that I'm unaware of. Okay. All these different, Kierkegaard would see these almost like different worlds, or certainly different classes are happening right now. No two of you are taking the same class. And I don't care how close any of you are, you might even have like this soul mate level status, but there's still going to be a part of you that your beloved cannot understand. You might say, Blackburn, that's not true. We share everything. We're totally transparent. We don't have any secrets. I don't care. You can tell them everything, but because they're not you, they are not going to get it. Have you ever noticed going home on family holidays? Maybe you experienced this last Christmas or whatever. And you go home and you're hearing your family talk about other Christmases or events, and you're just thinking, was I the only one there? Because their memories are so skewed and twisted about what actually took place. And so the individualist in existentialism is going to lead to this radical alienation where you realize no one else in the universe actually knows you or can know you. And this leads to angst. And I love this word angst because it means fear, anxiety, and dread, all rolled into one. But it's a fear, anxiety, and dread of you know not what. It's not like some particular thing you're afraid of or running from. It's like a splinter in your mind. You know something's wrong, but you can't put your finger on it, and you can't make it go away. Kierkegaard believed it was our alienation from God. That's what had us in this perpetual state of angst and funk, was because we knew we were under God's wrath or judgment. And until that was reconciled, there's no way we would not have those feelings of insecurity. Now, Kierkegaard's solution is Christ. And he believes if you have Christ in you, for the first time in your life, you can actually connect to other people. Because it's the Spirit of the Christ in you, or the Spirit of God in you, connecting with the Spirit of God in others. And this is the difference between like fellowship and friendship, where you're actually having a communion of the Spirit. And Kierkegaard believes, there's another theme, authenticity, that as long as we are the slaves of sin, we cannot be our true authentic selves, but we are in bondage, we're captive. So it actually takes this reconciliation to God through the person and work of Jesus Christ to allow us to be free and our true selves for the first time. And this is another key aspect of existentialism. They embrace the paradox. And remember, paradoxes are apparently contradictory truths. So here's some paradoxes for you. And see, for an Aristotelian black or white, either or mind, paradoxes means one of them is wrong. The existentialists are saying, oh no, paradoxes are showing you've come to the limits of human reason, and they become like the gatepost of capital T truth. So whenever I run into paradoxes, I just get giddy with excitement because I'm like, I'm getting close to the end, because my reason can no longer do the dialectic, and they just create these like a portal, and that's what I want to go through. So let's look at some of the paradoxes about being authentic. In order to truly live, one must die. It's only in being a slave to Christ that we will be free. We are insignificant little specks in the cosmos, and yet we're of infinite value and importance because we are made in the image of God. Wow. Those are all massive paradoxes. And instead of, like Aristotle or certain theologians who want it to be logical and rational, they will pick one side. Like, let's take the sovereignty free will issue, right? We have the Arminians saying, oh no, it has to be free will, and Reform or Calvinists saying, no, it has to be sovereignty, we can't diminish God. But if the scriptures teach both, right, but see, the existentialists are very comfortable living in that tension, whereas that Aristotelian mind, no, you have to diminish the passages that seem to speak against your point of view and exalt the passages that seem to reinforce it. But to me, that's a very poor hermeneutic. That's where it's more of an eisegesis. You're reading in your position into Scripture instead of trying to extract it out of Scripture. Yeah, if it teaches both, believe both if you're able. Yeah. So embrace the paradox. Be authentic. Think about how much that resonates with your generation, how much you have been affected by this. You know how put off you are by fake people. I just can't even handle it. Even for minutes, I just get agitated in my spirit. But even if it's someone I disagree with or I can't stand their values, if they're at least being real, I can appreciate them at a certain level or degree. I may not want to hang out with them, but I at least know what I'm getting. I'm not getting this facade that's telling me one thing, and there's a whole other thing going on behind it. So that authenticity. The problem is, in our culture, the whole point of enculturation or indoctrination is to take away your individuality, your authenticity, and try to conform you into this mental mindset, this construct. And I don't care if that's your elementary school or your Christian college or your church or your political party, they're all trying to get you to buy in, and then every time you go to a rally or a service or whatever, it's like a reinforcement, right? It's like this biofeedback loop where people are reinforcing that worldview or that perspective, trying to get you. And if you dissent, people will try to get you back in line or tell you why don't you go find another place to be, because you're not thinking right. There's something wrong in your head. Young women, how many expectations or limitations are put on you simply because of your gender in our culture? Yeah, like, oh, that's not ladylike. Or, I mean, just thinking about things like that. If you happen to be a very assertive female, chances are people have told you, stop being bossy. Right? People don't tell assertive young boys not to be bossy. They're just being boys, right? And so it's these sorts of labels and categories that try to box us in and take away our individuality and our freedom. And so many existentialists reject labels and categories. One of my favorite Kierkegaard quotes is, if you label me, you negate me. Okay, right? Because once you put a label on this, you don't have to deal with this. You can deal with your label that you've put warning, danger, do not open, and you put it up on that danger shelf, right? Or if it's someone that's resonating with you, you're just like good, noble, true, pure, and you put them there. But think about it. For years, I wouldn't even associate or let people call me a Christian. And it's not because I was ashamed of Jesus. It's because I was ashamed of what the word Christian had come to mean in our culture and society. And I knew if people asked me what religion I was, and if I said Christian, they were immediately just going to put that Christian label on me, put me on that shelf in their mind, and then not have to deal with me or what I believed, because they already knew what Christian meant, at least in their head. And so I started to tell people I was a follower of the way. And then if they really cared, they would ask, what way? And now we're having a conversation as I'm talking about the Jesus way. I haven't just been categorized and labeled and judged, basically, on something that may have nothing to do with me. I think now it's not so much Christian in our culture as maybe evangelical is taking on that sort of, when a lot of Americans hear evangelical, they're not thinking about grace and faith and love, they're thinking about right-wing politics. And that's a problem if that's not where you are, right? Or not what evangelical means to you. But how do you fight that cultural usage? Part of how I do it is trying to come up with weird, almost antithetical labels. Like I wrote a blog a while back called California Christian. Well, what does that mean? Right? See, I don't mind calling myself a California Christian because now people have to ask if they want to know what that means. And I see it very different. It's kind of eclectic, little bits and pieces, more open-minded, inclusive, tolerant. Those would be things. Now, are there dangers to that? Absolutely, right? You have pros and cons with these different things. But this idea, stop labeling other people, and certainly don't let other people label you. Make them deal with you as and it's part of why I look the way I do. Because if people want to get to know me, they have to get past all of this. Right? Say, I met a lot of, I like to call them fashion punks, and I know that's awful, I'm labeling them, but they're not punk subculturally, and like they're raging against society and authority and all that. They just like the piercings and the leather and the studs and the spiked hair, and so that's why I call them fashion punks instead of actual like political, socio-political punks. But what I find with a lot of young people, or any kind of person that has an extreme look, whether big spacers or piercings or face tattoos or whatever, I often take it as a challenge. It's like, are you willing to get past this to what's inside? And often I would encourage you, take the risk. It's often really worth getting to know what kind of person is in there and why they're putting up all this stuff. And I personally am attracted to those sorts of people. So rejects labels, categories. Freedom. Kierkegaard would say, without freedom, what's the point? Even this idea of like ethics or morality, if we're just cogs in a machine or God is his ultimate puppet master, then we don't even need to talk about good or evil or any of that. But if we do have real choice with real consequence, then everything we do matters. Every word, every thought, every deed. And freedom becomes the driving point. And to be authentic allows you to be free. As long as you're in this alienated, angsty, self-denial place, you'll never be free. Still no questions. How about this one? This is one of the things that got him excommunicated. I think he got excommunicated multiple times, which is pretty impressive. Truth is subjectivity. Why would that bother anyone? What does that mean? Truth is subjectivity. And it has to do with this whole idea where we get this word existentialism, experience-based knowledge. And what the premise is, you only really know, capital K know, what you have experienced. If you read it in a book, or your mama told you, or your teacher told you, it's just head knowledge. It's secondhand knowledge. Until you have personally experienced it, you don't really, capital K, know it. Anyone disagree with that?
No, I agree.
Okay. Let me give you an example. If you could read everything there was to know about a rose, exhaustive study, how they were first domesticated, all the different varieties, all the different parts, what caused them to smell or look a different way, would actually encountering a real physical material rose change your understanding at all? That's the existential question. And the existentialist would say, not only would it change your understanding, you really had no understanding until you actually smelled the rose with your own nose. You can read all about smelling roses and what they smell like, but until you actually personally, individually smell it, you don't know what a rose smells like. And that's the subjective piece. Now think of the theological ramifications. In 19th century Denmark, everybody knew about God. Everybody knew about Jesus. In fact, in his book, Attack Upon Christendom, another reason he got excommunicated, was he said, I live in the most amazing country where even the Jews and Muslims are practically Christians. The dogs and cats are Christians. The problem is, when everyone's a Christian, no one is. Woo, you're on fire today. It was like that Pixar, The Incredibles, right? The mom's trying to tell Dash, everyone's special, Dash. And he says, then that means no one's special, Mom. And it's like, oh, right, everything and nothing, right? There it is, again.
Well, that means too that, like, the word is not really how we get to know God, because we don't experience it through the word, we experience it through.
Now, you could certainly experience God through reading his word.
Yeah.
But it has to be an encounter with God, not a book, right? If you're counting on the Holy Bible to save you, you are sorely mistaken. What did Jesus tell the scribes and Pharisees? He says, you search the scriptures because in them you think you have life. But it's the very scriptures that speak of me. But they were blind. They couldn't even understand the very author of that book was standing before them. They had all this head knowledge. They could have quoted any passage to you, word perfect, but they didn't understand. They had a very head type of knowledge. I could buy a Clinton's auto repair manual to work on my Jeep. Is it called Clinton's? Clifton's? Anyways, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Chilton's? Anyways, it doesn't matter. I could study and all that, but until I actually pop open the hood, roll up my sleeves, and engage that vehicle, I don't know about repairing Jeeps. I could read all I want to, watch all the cooking shows on how to make wedding cakes. Until I actually bake that wedding cake, I do not personally, experientially know. I can watch all the crime drama shows and interventions and how to deal with junkies, but until I shoot heroin up my own veins, I don't know what it's like to be a junkie. Okay? This is existentialism 101. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some things I don't want to know firsthand experience, like being a junkie. I just as soon take it for granted that that's not a good thing based on other people's experiences. But I have to acknowledge I'm not basing that off my own knowledge or understanding. I'm basing it on an inference made on what happened to other people. Okay, that's not a direct knowing. Back to theology. In 19th century Denmark, everyone knew theology. Everyone knew the creeds. But Kierkegaard despaired that almost no one knew God. They knew about God, but they didn't know God. And this is what changed everything. Kierkegaard changed the question. When you take ethics with me, one of the first questions I'm going to ask you is, what is a Christian? Kierkegaard changes the question to, what does it mean to be a Christian? Do you see the existential difference? The first one, you could just rattle off the orthodoxy, the creeds, the basic things in our faith. But like I've told people 1,000 times, there are millions of people that chant those words and even believe them every day, and they are not Christians. They have Christian beliefs, they live in a Christian subculture, but they have not experienced God personally, directly. And so this is where Kierkegaard's headed. He's like, it's not just about good theology. It's not just about going to church. It's not just about living in a community of faith, but it's actually knowing God personally. People did not talk like this in the Middle Ages unless you were like a mystic. Kierkegaard's now saying, if you don't have a personal relationship with God, you're not even a Christian. You're just living in a Christian culture with Christian beliefs, but you are not a Christian because you have not encountered the Christ personally. Fascinating. Unfortunately, what happened with rationalist apologetics, what's apologetics? In Christian rationalism, what people are trying to do is to use different apologetical arguments to create a case to help people with their belief. And I'm going to call this the stairway up. It's kind of like the scholastics had their pillars of reason. Well, 19th and 20th century modern apologists were building their own stairways of reason. And this is really big in Christian apologetics today, Christian rationalism. And so, what kind of things might you do to try to prove that Christianity is true? The true religion. Say you're arguing with a Buddhist or an atheist or agnostic. What's something you might want to roll out to them?
Creation.
Okay. And that's part of what we're doing in this class. When we come back, we're going to start talking about pitting like young earth biblical creationism versus like Darwinian evolution. So that might be part of it. ICR, Answers in Genesis, those sorts of organizations are all in for this sort of work. What else could we do? We've got our like C.S. Lewis's, our Ravi Zacharias's, our Josh McDowell's, with his Evidence That Confirms Your Verdict book. He even has like an evidentialist Bible, so you can be reading through like the Old Testament and you come across Jericho, and then it will, in the footnotes, it will give like archaeological data of like how old the city was, what they found there, how it ties in with the biblical data. So it's a super great resource. But what Kierkegaard, the point he's trying to make is, we do all these sorts of things. We use theology. We use biblical archaeology. We use apologetics. We use philosophy, and I'm just going to put etc. here. So what we're doing is we get people as close as we possibly can with human reason so that these people are 99.9% certain that the Christian faith or religion is true. And so we get them right there at the edge, but still, and I don't care if you're Ravi Zacharias or Josh McDowell, all these people would still say you can only come to God through faith. But do you see what they've done? They've made faith, all you need is a 0.0 1% of faith. And so you're there, your knees are shaken, but you're going to do it, and you take that hop of faith into the loving arms of Jesus. Hallelujah. And Kierkegaard is like, are you people insane? If without faith it's impossible to please him, why would you use reason to try to minimize faith in God to the least amount possible? And Kierkegaard believed he was given a great intellect to tear down the strongholds of the intellectuals. So he used his reason to talk about how unreasonable Christianity is. What are some unreasonable things about Christianity?
Miracles.
What else? Things like virgin births, res from the dead.
Splitting of the sea.
What's that?
When Moses split the sea.
Right, sea splitting, talking snakes, worldwide flood. I mean, it just goes on and on. How about simply God loving us? Why would God love us? And Kierkegaard says the whole point of reason should drive us to our knees and have us calling out for God in mercy, which forces us to take a leap of faith. So Kierkegaard is actually using reason to make Christianity even more unreasonable, which heightens the amount of faith you have to believe. Fascinating. But once again, this is not wishful thinking type of faith. This is a faith that comes from God. It is a gift from God. And Kierkegaard believes faith is the surest way of knowing. But you see the paradox? What is faith? Hebrews defines it, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. If you're a scientific materialist, that just makes you want to put your head through a brick. The evidence of things not seen, the whole point of evidence is it's supposed to be those tangible, physical, material things. And now we have this biblical definition of, oh no, faith is allowing you to believe in what you cannot verify, what you cannot put through the scientific method. And yet, it gives you absolute and complete certainty. You see the problem if you have your faith in the wrong thing, or if it's self-generated faith, then you're on the ride to Hale-Bopp with coins on your eyes, right, up in Rancho Santa Fe. And it's not just about faith. It's like, where did the faith come from, and what is the faith in?
Isn't that kind of contradictory, though, that if Kierkegaard believes that you can only experience something, you can only know something through your experience, and God gives us faith through our inexperience of who he is.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it just doesn't make sense. Yeah, okay.
I know, you're like, that's not fair. Well, they don't care.
Yeah.
That's the beauty about this is postmodern thinking. You see how it leads to relativism, right? Because now everyone has their own little t truth. The problem is a lot of people think their little t truth is capital T truth. I'm perfectly fine people talking about, this is what I believe, this is my reality, this is my truth. I mean, I've been accused of that my whole adult life. Even at the school, other teachers are just like, oh, Fred, must be nice to live in your own little reality. And I'm just like, at least I know I'm living in my own little reality. What's frightening is you think your little reality is the big R reality. Woo! That's what should be concerning. Kierkegaard's what's called a fideist. Anyone know what a fideist is? That's not gonna work. Fideist. Whenever push comes to shove, between faith and reason, you always put faith over reason. That's what a fideist is. And so think of it as like a teeter-totter. If you're heavy in faith, Kierkegaard believes you'll be light in reason. And if you're heavy in reason, you're going to be light in faith. What do you guys think about that?
I think because we view reason as like our intellect, like our ability to reason well means that we are intelligent people, and so I just feel like our experience like makes us think that if you have faith, you're dumb.
And that's coming from what? Or where? Or who?
Our experience.
Do you feel like if you have faith, you're dumb?
No.
Okay. Yeah.
Is it possible to like be in the middle, like with faith and reason?
Yeah, the question was, can you be in the middle? Does it have to be an either or? Have we gone right back to the either or fallacy? Very good. And the postmodern would be like both and, right? Yeah. And that's how I would say it. Use reason for the things of reason and use faith for the things of faith. Just like Jesus talked about, render unto Caesar the things, and yeah, I'm using allegorical interpretation, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Yeah, if I don't want people, when I ask someone like, do you have enough gas to get there, and where will we be staying and having dinner, and all those sorts of pertinent, practical travel information. I don't want them to tell me, oh, Blackburn, stop being so pragmatic. Let go and let God. It's like, no. I'm going to let go and let God with the things God has told me to let go of. But if I got to plant a crop or teach a classroom or turn in a report, that's kind of on me and me doing certain things to accomplish other things. So that's an appropriate use of reason, analytical thinking, critical thinking, etc., planning ahead. But when it comes to things like, does God love me? Did he die for me? Did he rise from the dead? Is the scripture his holy word? I'm basing those on faith, not on my reason. But see, the problem is a lot of Christians don't want that kind of faith. They don't want to believe like fishermen or shopkeepers or homeschool moms. They want to believe like the Christian apologists, right? And we even have, and I know it sounds like I'm trying to bash people, but I'm not. I'm glad they're there. I think they're the ministers of God. But like William Lane Craig, his site is called Reasonable Faith. .org. And he will show you all sorts of reasons why your faith is rational. And you're not just a crazy medievalist. And maybe that is something a lot of you would enjoy and it would be appealing to you. To me, and once again, I've met William Lane Craig, really nice guy. It's just, it's an oxymoron. Reasonable faith. I'm with Kierkegaard on this. A reasonable faith to me means a very light faith. Kierkegaard likened it to like jumping into the ocean 70,000 fathoms deep of water, where you are just in it, but you are in God. And so you are signed, sealed, delivered, secure. Because truth is subjective, it makes it relative. And so what ends up happening, if you take existentialism to its logical conclusion, where each individual's experience is their own personal truth, it quite frankly leads to anarchy, where everyone does that which is right in their own eyes. And we're seeing this played out in our culture, and I don't want to get all political in here, but we are entering into like this post-capital T truth culture. It all becomes little t truths competing for each other. And so what people do is they just latch onto a narrative or an ideology And they just keep reinforcing it in their mind and then try to put down any other thing. And you can see that politically, you can see it theologically, you can see it socially, you can see it with gender issues, all these sorts of things where people get this narrative and they're having competing truth claims about what that means. And anarchy is basically just saying, you're not the boss of me, I'm the boss of me. But eventually this leads to nihilism. Anyone know what a nihilist is?
They don't care, right?
They don't care, but why don't they care?
Because there is no truth.
Yes, period. So not only are you not the boss of me,
No.
I'm not the boss of me. There is no me. I've actually only met a couple people who thought they were nihilists, but it's really easy to find out if they're true nihilists. All you have to do is ask the nihilist, who doesn't believe in anything? And if they say, I don't believe in anything, they're not a nihilist. Because they at least believe there's a them that doesn't believe in anything. A true nihilist wouldn't even believe in their own existence. That's why there's theoretical nihilists, but I've never actually met an actual nihilist. But this is where existentialism leads if individualism takes its place. I mean, that's so wild. And now we see this resurgence in, I like to call it Marxism light, when we have like democratic socialism and all those sorts of things. And so you see these tensions, but our culture is also so ruggedly individualistic, right? We don't like the government telling us what to do. So we have this wild tension between the collectivist, the Borg, and the radical individual. And it will be interesting to see if our culture can find the synthesis between the two until we go into that next movement. All right, well, that's our little journey of Western philosophy from Thales to Kierkegaard, and that will set us up nicely as when we come back and we begin the discussion of origins. So now we're going to take all that philosophical knowledge and we're going to turn it onto origins, and I'm going to look at it from those different worldview pieces.